32, Alessandria, Piedmont, northern Italy. I had the privilege of living during the war, which is a good school. One learn how to survive. And, well, then I studied philosophy, and then I worked for 4 years at the newborn Italian television. That was a good experience for me to see a new medium growing up in the early years. And then I worked all my life first in a publishing house and at the university as a professor. I think that's all. I have no precise news about my death, but...
¿Quién no ha leído a Umberto Eco? Como filósofo y profesor de la Universidad de Bolonia, es autor de textos fundamentales de semiótica y de crítica literaria, sobre todo su libro La Obra, abierta. Como novelista, obtuvo lectura mundial con El nombre de la rosa y El péndulo de Foucault. Es profesor en la Universidad de Bolonia y ahora está en Nueva York para rendir homenaje a otro escritor italiano, Italo Calvino. La última obra de Umberto Eco se titula Kant y el ornitorrinco. Umberto Eco, you have given imaginative force to your works on literature and philosophical force to your novels. How does the theory of fiction relate to the creation of fiction?
You know, when very late in my life, around my 50s, I wrote the first novel, I had the impression of doing something absolutely different from my theoretical work. So I didn't think to any theory. It was only afterwards that the critics, the readers, found certain relationships between my novels and my theoretical studies. And it is, well, it looks very, very thinkable because I am not a split personality, I am not a schizophrenic, and so probably, I mean, if a scholar on human anatomy, who knows very well the structure of the skeleton, the way in which we move our legs, start jogging, probably this knowledge will influence a little his right posture, but without exaggeration, because, you know, everybody knows that when stepping down from a staircase, you start thinking that you are stepping down from a stair, you stumble and you fall. So one has not to think about a theory when writing something creative, but certainly one must know that he is influenced by his or her theoretical background.
I am interviewing you in a country, the United States, that have no Middle Ages. In Mexico and in Latin America, we feel that we had Middle Ages because we were educated during 3 centuries in the philosophy of Saint Thomas Aquinas. What is your conception of the intellectual work of Saint Thomas?
Oh my God, which is the right expression. Well, you know that I made my doctoral dissertation on Thomas Aquinas, on the aesthetics of Thomas Aquinas, and I like him. I like him because he was certainly one of the most intelligent person in the human history, along with St. Augustine, Aristotle, and few others. What did Aquinas? What he did? He was governing an immensity, a great quantity of wisdom, and trying to unify it in a perfect iron-like system, solving every possible question from the point of view of a luminous common sense. Obviously, today the system doesn't doesn't work so well, even though there are people still believing that after Thomas Aquinas there is no more possible philosopher. But for his times, he was really a giant who was able to keep under control the entire knowledge of his time. That's why he became the doctor of the church, because it has an enormous capacity of picking up the most difficult and complex questions, to see one side and the other side, to compare and to find a very easy solution. In this sense, he was a genius. His genius was due to his simplicity.
Were the Middle Ages based on a close hierarchy of values?
In comparison with our modern times, certainly yes. Today we are looking for a plurality of point of views, a sort of a very tolerant acceptation of different truths. The attitude of a medieval thinker was exactly the contrary, to try to unify everything from a single point of view. But you know, Middle Ages do not exist. They were an invention of late historians, because if you consider that the Middle Ages go from the fall of the Roman Empire, so the 476, to the Renaissance, it makes 1,000 years. You cannot give a single definition for 1,000 years of culture. So there were different kinds of Middle Ages. And so in the Middle Ages you find also a great capacity for understanding the point of view of the enemy. But then the Middle Ages were not only the Christian Middle Ages. For instance, the Arab philosophy at the time was pretty tolerant, open to many perspectives. But when between the 12th and the 13th century in the Middle Ages arrived all the works of Aristotle translated from Greek by the Arabs, there was such a sudden change of mentality, of point of view, that today we would say, oh no, they were not defending a very definite point of view. They were open to novelty. Then there is another thing. A modern thinker tries desperately to show that what is thinking is absolutely new, unheard, even though it is not. The attitude of the medieval thinker was exactly the opposite. Even when he was saying something new, he pretended to say only what his ancestors had said. So he was always pretending not to innovate. So it's very difficult sometimes to detect the innovation, because they do their best to conceal it, to cover it, not to show that they are saying something new. So they were so different from us from this point of view that sometimes they give the impression of repeating the same system of values, and as a matter of fact, they were innovating.
Umberto Eco, what is an open work? When did an open work become possible?
Well, you are speaking of an old book of mine of 62, Obra, abierta, but even at that time I was continuously quarreling by saying that I had never seen an open work in my life. So it was a sort of abstract definition of some possibilities that every work of art should exhibit. I mean, the possibility of supporting different interpretation. When I wrote Obra abierta, it was because we were in a moment with the avant-garde movements in which they were producing physical movable open works, like the mobiles of Alexander Calder, of a certain new music by Berio or Boulez. And so I insisted on this tendency of that time to produce work of art that you can manipulate yourself. But when I spoke of openness, I meant that this, even Don Quixote is an open work, because it, during the centuries, it has supported several interpretations. At that time, it looked very provocative to speak of this openness of the interpretations. Today, I think we have exaggerated in the opposite sense, saying that you can interpret in any way a text, which is not true. That's why in the 19th I wrote another book called The Limits of Interpretation, because I think that there are interpretations that are not acceptable. But this will raise an enormous question about which in academia people are continuously.
Usted seguramente ya conoce a este artista.
Ahora descubra sus múltiples facetas.
En una exposición singular.
El Instituto Nacional de Bellas Artes le invita.
Diego Rivera, Arte y Revolución.
Una nueva mirada a su vida y a su arte.
En el Museo de Arte Moderno.
Este es un espacio reservado para la memoria. Mi pueblo, levantado sobre la llanura, lleno de árboles y de hojas, como una alcancía donde hemos guardado nuestros recuerdos. La memoria está en las bibliotecas, ferias de libro, librerías o en tu casa. Leer para ser mejores.
As the century ends, there seems to be a general opinion that Ulysses of James Joyce is the greatest novel of the 20th century. Do you agree with that?
I am always trying to escape from those games, which is the biggest, the most important work of this century, because how can you say that it is Ulysses and not the Recherche of Proust or something else? It's like to discuss whether it was better Raphael or Michelangelo, Ariosto or Tasso, Calderon or Góngora. There are trivia games for quiz shows or for the last page of a magazine. Centuries are very complex. Think of the 17th century in which you have the Spanish Baroque, you have Shakespeare, you have how is it possible to say this is the first one? We are not making sport. Only in sport you have the first one.
Umberto Eco, and besides writing, do you have time for reading?
Now, this is a good question because people usually think that to read means to stay peacefully seated and reading a novel or a poem. With my job, I read very little printed pages because I have to read thousands and thousands of once typewritten. Today they are printed by the computer, but doctoral dissertations, papers, or even the books of my colleagues that arrived to me before to be printed. So I suffer of this limitation. I realize that I can have a book peacefully in my hand only when I go to sleep. But in order to reassure you, I have 30,000 books in my house, so they're enough.
Have a good library at home. Oh, no, what I meant is, what do you rather read? Contemporary novels?
That's another question, because I realized it very late, but it is true. Before starting writing novels, I was reading a lot of contemporary writers. When I started to write the first novel, and then more and more with the following ones, I discovered that it's very difficult for me to read, for instance, a contemporary novelist. Because if he or she is different from me, I don't like him or her. If it is the same, I don't like this sort of clone. If it is or she is better, I become upset. So I read more and more 18th and 19th century. Now, obviously, I read also contemporary stuff, but less than before. For instance, I don't understand many novelists that also make a review of other novels. I feel incapable. Once I did it, not today, because I feel biased. I feel biased.
Tomorrow you're going to be accompanied by two writers during the homage for Italo Calvino,
Carlos Fuentes
and
Salman Rushdie.
Yes. Do you read Salman Rushdie?
Yes, but we had also a discussion on his one of his last books at the Pivot program in Paris. Yes, I like him.
And how about Latin Americans? You read Latin Americans?
Well, you know, Latin American writers at a certain point in the 60s had conquered Italy, and I think to have been largely influenced by them, because altogether they discovered a new sense of narrativity. When in Europe we had arrived at the last station of experimentation, in which there was no more story, no more, like the blank canvas in painting. When you have arrived in painting to the blue canvas of Klein Le Monochrome, the red canvas of Rothko, the white canvas of Manzoni, it was impossible to go further. At the time there was a so-called new figurative painting. Well, in this sense, the South American novelists in general revealed the possibility of a new joy of narrating, and in this sense they were seminal for many of us.
How do you relate the work of James Joyce, on one side to the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, and on the other to the historical vision of Vico?
Joyce said only for Finnegan's Wake that he was influenced by the theory of historical cycle by Vico, but it was only a piece of information he received. Critics sometimes find in Finnegan's Wake a lot of clear or disguised quotations of Vico, Bruno, but in fact, for Joyce, they were not so important. They were ways of exciting his mind. That's true that in Finnegan's Wake there is the idea of a sort of historical cyclic development, but it was enough to have read an encyclopedia article on Vico to say so. Different was the story with Thomas Aquinas, and it is a very strange story. Because if you go on in the biography of Joyce, you discover that probably he didn't read Aquinas. He received some information about Aquinas through his Jesuit masters. But the way in which, in Daedalus, he interprets the aesthetics of Aquinas is absolutely perceptive. He understood it better than many scholars. That was struck me because it happened to me to read Daedalus at the time I was preparing my doctoral dissertation on Aquinas, and I said, listen, this young man, because at the time he was a young man, understood Aquinas better than many big scholars who wrote. And then I discovered that he confesses it. He say, I read Aquinas to a bunch of scattered sentences. So it was some penguin editions, so to speak, circulating in the Jesuit college. But that was why I fell in love with Joyce very early in my life, finding a sort of secret parenthood, also because he, by studying Aquinas, abandoned religion. And it happened the same to me.
Umberto Eco, you are a man of philosophy, of literature, and semiotics. Tell us more about semiotics.
This is a forbidden question because it took to me 40 years to understand something about semiotics, and I have not yet finished. But as everybody knows, there is an interest in all the systems of science we use, not only words, but gesture of painting and so on. The problem is rather why I arrived to be concerned with semiotics, because it arrived to me a little late, after my 30s. And I think it was that you have quoted my Obra, abierta, in which I was studying the contemporary art and the contemporary poetics, so let's say the upper side of the whole story. But in the same years, probably because of the fact that I was working in the television, and so I was provoked by the existence of mass media, I had started to analyze the problem of mass media, and the book which collected my first essays in this field is Apocalypticos y Integrados, as it is in the Spanish translation. So I was, on one side, interested in high experimental art, and on the other side, in what was conceived at that time the lower side. And then at that point I felt schizophrenic. I say, but what is the link between those two forms of expression? And then I felt the need of a general theory of communication and signification, which was able to take into account both sides of my research. We were at the beginning of the 60s when Roland Barthes was starting his elements of semiology. I met the great linguist Roman Jakobson. There was a general atmosphere pulling a lot of people towards the study of science. And then that's why I arrived to be a semiotician. We were all obliged to invent our own discipline, even though I always assumed that semiotics existed 2,000 years ago.
Umberto Eco, thank you very much. Con Umberto Eco en Nueva York, Silvia